there is an inherent resistance to that in our culture, and
Mm,
that resistance comes from mostly a small group of men,
mm,
because patriarchy also screws over men.
mm.
They're the first victims of patriarchy. Those three
I would agree.
promises we described
Yeah.
are examples of that. And it's actually a very small group of men who benefit from patriarchy, and
Yeah.
they hold a disproportionate amount of power. So it is in their interest to resist what you described as coming together and solving things collectively. Imagine if we did that.
Hi, hello, and welcome. Welcome to another Marty's Minute Meditations. What you're about to experience is a conversation I had with Jindy Mann. In this conversation, we discuss masculinity and manhood and how it relates to nature and masculinity of the past. We also discuss how men could start to find their own individual masculinity in this world, how they could solve their own problems by asking the right questions. If you enjoy this talk, hit that like button, subscribe, hit that notification bell, become a martyr for manhood, and donate monthly on Marty's Patreon page or his Buy Me a Coffee account. Now, without further ado, here's the conversation between Jindy Mann and myself. I hope you enjoy it. Just to start this podcast episode, I would love for just me and you to just take a quick, deep breath in and a breath out together to kind of just establish the space. So we'll take a breath in and out. And another one so that we can kind of find this connection as men in this space, as I feel a lot of men are not allowed to do with other men. So another breath in and out. Great, thank you. Thank you for doing that with me, Jindy. Now, today for my audience, I have Jindy Mann with me. And I'm going to let Jindy introduce himself and talk about what he does. But Marty just wants to say that he's been very interested in talking to him because he works with men's circles. He's working with a lot with coaching men. And Marty wants to look inside of the minds of men today and what they're dealing with. And I think Jindy's going to help me with that. So Jindy, I'm going to let you take it from here for a hot second. What are your passions? What do you do? What do you love to experience in life? And what is your mission here?
Mm, beautiful question. Great to be here, Marty. Thanks for
Oh,
having me on.
oh, thank you for
Looking
having me.
forward to this conversation.
Mm,
Um, so I guess I do in terms of my mission, three things that are all related. I do
mm,
leadership coaching, I do organizational consulting and work, and I do work with men and masculinity. And that's principally focused around creating spaces and conversations for men to explore things in a way that they might not do elsewhere, and to
mm,
explore things that they might not give space to elsewhere. Um, and so my mission, perhaps, I guess, across all three of those things, is to um, create self-awareness in everyone that I work with, and to raise the level of awareness, and start to recognize who we are, why we're doing what we're doing, and what we might want to change once we have that awareness. And that's particularly true in the work that I do with men. And the strapline we have for our work is there are 4 billion ways to be a man.
quite beautiful. And that's the line that kind of stood out for Marty is that there are 4 billion ways to be a man. And Marty wants to know all those ways, and Marty's wondering if he might know one of those ways in order to be a man. But I guess that's Marty actually just got what that tagline means because there's 40 or 4 billion men in the world. So, wow, that went right over Marty's head. Anyway, yes, so that is what interests Marty in your work is kind of that line to kind of illuminate the individuality in manhood again. Is that what you would say you'd like to do?
Mm. We're interrogating, or allowing men to interrogate,
Mm,
the notion of what man even means. What is a
mm,
man, and what is masculinity?
mm,
And find some meaning for themselves. We're not telling them the answer. We're not saying or prescribing any answers to those questions. So it's allowing them to explore that question and find something meaningful. Because gender is one of the first identities we take on board or we take up when we're children, very early on. And we do it unconsciously and without question. And then what comes with that is a set of expectations around our gender. Yeah. So that's really what we're kind of exploring with men.
Excellent. You say that you allow the man to be introspective, to kind of solve it himself. Do you find that it's important to allow men these days to kind of find the answers on their own instead of letting others find it for them?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I'm going to kind of correct myself here.
Sure.
I think we're in this moment where men are, or society in general is exploring these ideas about what is a man and what is masculinity. And there is a sort of tendency to sort of say, well, this is what positive masculinity looks like. And that term positive masculinity is being used a lot as an antithesis to toxic masculinity. So we're saying, don't be like this, but be like this. And the danger in that is we're putting ourselves in the role of arbiters. We're kind of saying, we're just creating another version of man that we're saying all men should be like. And what we're sort of saying is, let's almost get past these generally binary notions of gender and these strict ideas around gender. And actually, I think we probably need to do a bit of both at the same time, because men and boys still need some sense of direction of travel or something to aim for. But at the same time, in parallel, I think there is something about getting beyond any notion of some gender-based role. So both of those things need to coexist, I think. And you said something about finding solutions or answers. And for us in our work, you don't always find solutions or answers. It's actually inviting men into a space where they don't find solutions or answers. They explore things that might not have an obvious answer. And that's the journey. That's the result in itself.
That sounds pretty scary, to almost go into a space and find more questions than answers, don't you think?
Yeah, it can be, for sure. What we notice men find in our groups beyond answers is connection. And if there's one theme perhaps that we see over and over again in our groups, is men seeking connection, men knowing that they're not alone in the questions they're asking themselves, the things they're dealing with, their struggles, their hopes, their dreams, their anxieties. So in that sense, they perhaps find something more meaningful than fixed answers.
Almost that it's more of a journey and an exploration instead of a destination to hope to arrive at right now.
Yeah. It's a lived experience of being with a group of men, being seen and heard, and seeing and hearing other people, and realizing, hey, we're in this together.
Right. Yeah, because Marty is constantly trying to find the answers, and he finds that as he's stressing over the answers, he's forgetting the moment and enjoying the moment and enjoying, the actual joy and fun of the questions, right? I think men these days feel burdened by the questions because we have a culture that wants us to just be in the destination right now. And it takes from us the joy and the fun and the play of not knowing and maybe messing up, right? I think we forget that, making mistakes or having quote-unquote failures. Marty likes to call failures little oopsies, That's what his mother used to call them, because that helps him to remember that it's all, it's all lighthearted and it's okay, right? So I want to get back to this idea that you had said, and I had kind of repeated that, trying to help men ask the questions themselves, inviting them to ask the questions themselves instead of finding a kind of person to ask the right questions for them or solve their problems. Because Marty feels like men these days seek out, you have individuals like Andrew Tate or, Jordan Peterson, and feel how you will about either one of them, But Marty feels like young men especially find these men, these idols, right? And then they look to them for answers. Not even the right questions, but the right answers right now, instead of doing the work themselves. In your experience with helping men, with doing the leadership and the organizational coaching, do you find that people approach you looking for answers immediately? Or do you think that they're more open to questions and explorations that you have to offer?
I would say most of the men I work with on a one-to-one basis come with a level of curiosity and openness. And that also perhaps emerges through our conversations in how we agree we're going to work together. I'm not their guru. I'm not going to tell them the answer. So with some men, that's not the case. And I think particularly younger men, and I don't work with younger men so much, there is what you described. There is a seeking of gurus and people who will tell us how we should be. This is what masculinity is. This is what a man needs to be. And it's very alluring. It's very tempting when someone's presenting those ideas. And they're often themed around power and gaining power. So that's definitely present. And this this tendency towards looking for a fixed answer is a very masculine trait. And it takes us away from some of the things that you described: creativity, play, making mistakes, learning, being open. It takes us away from that sort of spontaneity.
You say that this kind of searching for an answer is a male trait. Can you expand on that? Can you kind of dive into that a little bit more?
There's a role that men often take up that I will kind of call problem solver or fixer. And so we, before we start one of our groups, we talk about that quite explicitly in our principles, that we're not here to fix each other. And we're not here to tell each other the answer or give each other advice unless it's explicitly requested. Because it is a very, very masculine tendency, not necessarily male tendency, but masculine tendency to hear that someone has a problem or something they're struggling with and begin to tell them what they should do. And begin to try and solve the problem. And that's not always coming from a bad place. It's often coming from a good place of, how can I fix this? And that's a very head-based, sort of logical, rational, cultural traits in modern masculinity that we learn, I think, at a very young age. That this is one of the roles of men, is to fix problems.
Do you find that it might be a wise solution for men to take time to stop solving problems? For instance, if a man sees a woman pulled over on the side of the street, she has a flat tire, maybe that man knows how to change that flat tire, so he pulls over. Does he choose to help her? Should he allow her to be independent and strong and to go, you know what, I have faith that you can solve this problem on your own. I'm going to drive off in the middle of this rainstorm and let you change that tire so you can feel empowered. So I also exercise my ability to not need to solve a problem. That's just a hypothetical situation that Marty's never encountered before.
Well, in that specific situation, there's a couple of things. There's just common humanity and how you might want to respond as a human, and then I think there's permission and choice. So, do you need help? And if the answer is yes, then yeah. Would you like me to help you?
Do you find that women may feel uncomfortable these days asking for help, especially from men?
I mean, I guess I can only speak from personal experience, and the women in my life are good at asking for help from anyone, generally.
That's good.
And that is perhaps a more feminine trait, a willingness to say, I don't know, I could do with a bit of help, or I'm struggling with this.
Do you find that within your coaching for men, that even in that open environment, it's hard for men to accept help, to ask for help?
Less so in coaching. I think there's a kind of confirmation bias in a client or a person who is interested in having coaching in the first place.
Right.
They're already open to some curiosity, some sense of exploration, and some desire to increase their self-awareness. So it's a kind of self-selecting population of men who are generally more open to not knowing.
Right, right. Well, it's good to know that there are men that are seeking the help and the questions that they need to be asking. I sometimes wonder with men, especially because there is I recently saw you posted on LinkedIn this kind of article surrounding the rate of suicide in men, right? And how it's higher than women in places like UK, Germany, the US, right? This kind of unwillingness to seek help. Where do you think that comes from? Why is that such a male trait to kind of, or masculine trait to deny help or even admit that there might be something wrong?
Mm. There's a socialization that happens with boys at quite a young age as they're starting to develop into adolescence and head towards adulthood. And in that development, what typically happens in this certainly modern Western idea of masculinity is well, James Hollis describes three unconscious promises that a boy makes in order to become a man. The first is he disconnects from intimacy in relationships, because intimacy is deemed feminine, too feminine for the modern idea of masculinity. So immediately you can start to see he's becoming isolated and individual.
Right.
So,
I wanna stop. I apologize. I'm sorry to step into your speaking space, but this idea of intimacy, how would you define intimacy? Because I think Marty hears that a lot, the fact that, men aren't allowed to be quote unquote intimate. But what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
mm, for me, it means being able to be with and express the fullest expression of myself, or at least a very full expression of myself. So not just vulnerability and my fears and my anxieties, but also my joy and my
Mm.
delights and my
Oh,
dreams and my wishes. And when we limit one side of the spectrum, we also limit the other in
right.
emotional expression. So if we're able to express ourselves more fully, typically the person we're with will reciprocate. And in that is
Right.
a real intimacy and a real connection.
That's lovely. Yes, that idea that intimacy is almost a surrendering to the outside world of every possible emotional choice on that emotional rainbow is really beautiful and really sad that men don't feel open to even sharing their joy, something that they could spread or just, sit in a space with. So thank you for answering that. I apologize for interrupting. Please continue. There was, I think you had the second thing that young boys have to do.
Sure. And lovely interruption and question. So the second unconscious promise that James Hollis describes is disconnecting from intuition. So we
Mm,
disconnect from our own embodied wisdom. We don't trust our instincts. We don't trust emotions and feelings. We start to view the world through a rational lens. That
mm,
I fix things through thinking about them. Because again, to connect with feelings and emotions is a feminine thing. It's not a
right.
masculine thing. And then the third kind of promise a boy starts to unconsciously make is to live to some external standards and rules around
Mm,
being a man. And the challenge there is that no one ever really knows what those rules are really clearly. We don't
right.
know who created them, and therefore we don't know how to challenge them. So we're kind of living to this external set of rules that have no end, and there's no way in which you'll ever know. No one will ever tap you on the shoulder and say, you're ticking all the boxes here.
Mm. What do you think are those kind of rules that men need to live by? Is it the three unconscious biases that you're mentioning, or do you think there are other rules beyond that we get and kind of perpetuate through our lives and society?
Yeah, I think there's many, and there's guy who does a lot of work in this space. I think his name's Mark Green. He's written about this, and he talks about the man box. And the man
Mm,
box is this quite sort of confining arena in which men must operate. Arena sounds too big, actually. It's quite a small, narrow
mm,
space in which, as a man, we must operate. And for me, one of the thoughts that springs to mind as one of these rules or expectations we must meet is to be self-sufficient, to do things alone, to figure things out on our own. And this comes up in our groups over and over again. This feeling that guys have, often the root of a lot of their stress and pressure and anxiety is they feel that they must solve whatever's going on in their life alone, and they mustn't share their problems with anyone else because that would burden other people and also make them less of a man.
hmm. Which is interesting because if we go way back when, right, and back in time when there were more, you know, tribal peoples, right? The men were never alone, right? There was never the king of the jungle, right? There may have been a leader male, I'm assuming, but there were other men to also help carry the burden. And then there were also the women that helped carry a whole other burden. And I think we forget these days that most problems in the past with human beings were solved together. Very rarely were, men on their own solving problems. But we kind of get this idea that that's the way it's done because we see men inventing these things and solving these problems and becoming rich and becoming famous. And then, Marty sees those men and he goes, wow, wouldn't it be great to be a man like that with all that money and power and the ladies, right? You know, Marty's looking for his one goddess, but sometimes he thinks how wonderful it would be to have 2, 3, 4, 10 goddesses surrounding him. But Marty knows that that's not the kind of guy he is, right? That he would prefer the one wonderful goddess. But what is it? What do you think it is that makes men long for that kind of life, right? We get the Andrew Tates and the David Blazarians or whoever that was, and men like that kind of give us this image that success means all the ladies and all the money and all the fancy cars. Why do you think that is so prevalent in the male mind these days?
Well, I want to go back to what you were saying earlier, which I think was a really lovely and important point, and then
Oh,
try and join the dots back to this. So,
sure.
um, you were talking about way back when and tribes
Mm,
and communities that we lived in. And we talk about this a lot. That's the reason we describe our group as a circle.
mm,
Um, Way back when, and we could probably say maybe 150 years ago, there was still an element of this. If you go even further back, there was much more of this. There was communities, there was living together in close proximity. If
mm,
you go right back to sort of pre-modern society, there was tribes, and sitting around in circles or sitting around in fires around a fire was an everyday
mm,
occurrence. So, as you said, men were never alone. They were never solving things alone. They were only ever doing things as part of a group. And the same with women, and the same with the community overall. They were only ever doing things collectively. And what started to happen with industrialization and modern capitalism is that we start to become atomized individuals.
mm,
So men typically used to live and work or work quite close to home. Living and working were quite close to each other.
mm,
So they were sort of around the same area, seeing the same people, not that far from home, sometimes working from home. If they had some sort of manual trade, they might be
mm,
working from the place they lived in. So they were never too far from their family. They knew all the people around them. They were constantly in connection and in a sort of collective and in community. As we started to travel to go to places of work, to offices and to factories and to other places, a couple of things happen. Firstly, there's now an individual traveling away from his family unit and away from his community to go to work. And secondly, there's uh, there's this inherent competition going on. I'm going to this place of work, and in this place of work is almost like an arena of competition, and I've got to beat the other guy, particularly in professional environments.
mm.
So you can see how that's evolved into our sort of modern day workplaces. Where I used to live in London. I lived in London for 19 years, and it's extraordinary when I look back at it.
Hmm.
The average commute, I think, is something like between 40 and 50 minutes each way. So almost 2 hours of your day is traveling on public transport,
Wow.
which is quite a stressful experience at the best of times. And then you're going to these high pressure environments where there is, by definition, competition. We're competing with each other. We're trying to, outdo each other to win at some sort of game. So that's become our culture. That's become the sort of foundations of not just our working cultures, but culture and society overall.
Right.
This idea of external success and achievement and attainment and material goods and wealth and power. And so it's from that people like Andrew Tate have emerged, promising young men, I know how to make you rich. I know how to make you powerful, because young men are feeling alienated.
Hmm.
This journey we've been through in the system we're in now is failing. Actually, it's failing not just young men, but everyone. And so
Right.
alienated men are looking for, well, how do I get that back? How do I get power and money? Because that looks pretty good from what Andrew Tate's
Yeah.
presenting to me.
Yeah, it's interesting because how are we supposed to find a brotherhood, find friendships between other men when we're told by society that every other man out there comes from another tribe, right? That every other man is a threat to us. I think that's an interesting idea and a scary one, because if we perpetuate that idea of every man is a threat, then how are we supposed to work together to make a better world, right? It's almost like they plan this out to split us up as men, to separate us, to make us, only little atomized things so that we're weak. And then because, if we were to come together, wow, that would be
Yeah.
a pretty amazing thing, right? What we would be able to do with the world. But I guess it's step by step, right? And it's through the help of people like you. So,
Yeah. And as you alluded to, there is an inherent resistance to that in our culture, and
mm,
that resistance comes from mostly a small group of men,
mm,
because patriarchy also screws over men.
mm,
They're the first victims of patriarchy. Those three
I would agree.
promises we described
Yeah,
are examples of that, and it's actually a very small group of men who benefit from patriarchy, and
yeah.
they hold a disproportionate amount of power. So it is in their interest to resist what you described as coming together and solving things collectively. Imagine if we did that.
It would be amazing. Well, and I find that it's interesting because you have a lot of women that come out and go, "Oh, toxic masculinity this, toxic masculinity that," the patriarchy, right? And then they blame and talk about every man they run into about this thing, and yet they expect men to help and say, "Well, it affects you too." Well, then maybe a little sympathy here would be nice instead of, blaming every single thing on Marty. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. That's just a little frustration coming out, and Marty tries to be a little balanced about it. Now, I want to talk about this man circle that you have. Is it man's circle or is it men's circle? Because it is Jindy Mann's circle, technically, right? But is it man's or men's?
Men's circle.
Okay,
And
men's circle.
it's we have our organization is called Leader Brother Son, and it's
Oh,
myself and a couple of other facilitators and coaches
interesting.
who run these groups, and we call them circles. Yeah, men's circles.
Lovely. How did you decide to begin this? I mean, you said that you were working with other people to do this. Did you kind of have the idea on your own to start it, or was this in discussion with others? How did this emerge and manifest itself?
Yeah, it's a it's a great question. And I'll try to give you a short answer. I think it started in childhood for me. I was
Mm-hmm.
I was born in dual patriarchal culture, British and
Mm.
Indian,
Ooh.
and lost my dad when I was 13. So was looking for elder male role models, and um, making lots of mistakes as I became a man and trying to figure it all out and going through my own struggles. Then went into corporate consulting world, and worked in all sorts of different organizations, including startups. And over the course of almost 20 years, and in my own friendships and through my own life, I was seeing the same patterns repeating. Men struggling, men suffering, and that gets inflicted onto everyone else.
Mm.
And this, although I didn't know it at the time, that is effectively patriarchy, and that's the system that we were all operating in. So about 15 years ago, I realized something wasn't working for me, and I felt quite lost. And I started working with a coach, and that led to this incredible journey, which continues now, of exploration and self-development and learning and growing my own awareness. And as we continued to work together and kept in touch, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we started to, well, this conversation kind of surfaced in our work together that I've lived a very masculine life, but also have a very feminine side to me, side to me that was emerging through our work. And that meant I kind of had this foot in both camps and felt really called to do something about what I was seeing. I'm a person who's doing this sort of work, and it's a work that's very rooted in emotions and the heart and concepts that would be considered feminine. If I were to give you the sort of headline bio of my life, it looks very masculine. Played in soccer teams my whole life, played a lot of sports, interested in masculine pursuits like cycling and climbing up mountains, worked in these corporate masculine environments. So both sides of me exist. And so I felt drawn to, I almost felt I had this opportunity or responsibility to do something in this space. So that idea sat with me for a couple of years. Then I met a couple of other coaches who were interested in doing similar work. And then we decided to just start offering some free groups. And that's where it started almost 3 years ago.
So the question that I kind of want to raise is, you mentioned that, you had done masculine things when you were younger, you played soccer, you engaged in the corporate world. Was there something in that world that you felt fulfilled you, that there was something that even when you left it, or that there was something very attractive to that world that you still feel was, even though it was predominantly in the masculine space, that there was something beneficial or healthy in that space?
Quite a lot, actually. And I think it's a great question, because I think it's important to recognize that this isn't about a rejection of the masculine. So one of the things I loved about consulting was solving complex problems. And that required all sorts of different aspects of myself, not just intellectual, but to understand people. From a work perspective, I didn't enjoy competing in those environments. I tried to do it, but I didn't particularly like it. From a sports perspective, I've always loved competing. And that's still an important and valuable and precious and enjoyable space for me, to have a focused thing where I'm healthily competing in some sort of activity.
Healthfully competing, you say? What would you define as healthfully competing? Because I think we as men do get, Marty gets pretty aggressive sometimes. I know it doesn't seem like he can. A lot of people look at Marty and go, oh, he's a little teddy bear. But trust me, the teddy bears have fangs too. And, he can get competitive. But Marty always wonders, where is the healthy competition, right? And where do you think that is?
For me, it's sports. And I probably used to take sports too seriously in my 20s. But then it became a really focused and useful space to express some aggression and some competition. Because ultimately I was an amateur. When the game finished, it's over. My livelihood doesn't depend on this. And we could shake hands and go home.
Do you think that there's a space for that kind of competition in everyday life, like outside of sports? Is there a way to translate that, like you said, that aggression or that that kind of desire to win somewhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a difference between a desire to win and a desire to beat someone.
Hmm.
And so that energy can be channeled in whatever we're doing. And if I speak from a very personal perspective, what are the things that I challenge myself with? Well, I try to write every day because I really enjoy it, and so that's a challenge I set myself. I read a lot, so I have a, a list of books and a certain number of books I try to read every year. And that for me is about challenging myself to grow and learn and keep developing skills and learning new
Hmm.
things. And there's a number of other things, but it's I'm no longer competing with anyone else or trying to be
Hmm.
better than anyone else.
It's almost like you're the Jindy that wants something better, competing against the Jindy that wants to sit around and eat potato chips, right?
I mean,
That
he
sounds like a
exists
healthy
too.
comp. Yeah, he does. I mean, there's a Marty that exists that way too. Marty woke up this morning and he was like, "Wow, wouldn't it be great to be the Marty that cancels this whole interview and sleeps in? That'd be really good." But then, more determined Marty had to come out and be a little bit competitive there, right? Well, I'll beat that Marty. So that's good. I want to go back and if this is okay with you, you mentioned that you were raised in two patriarchal societies, right? One being in the UK and two being of Indian origin, right? In an Indian family. How do you find, if you're willing to discuss this, and especially in terms of, losing your father at a young age, and I'm sorry for that, can you go more in depth into what that meant at that time, being a young boy raised in that environment?
Mm. Um, so in our family, and I suppose this was typical or is typical of Indian families,
Mm.
there was a hierarchy, an almost explicit hierarchy based on age and gender.
Mm.
Um, and I was the youngest of four, two brothers
Ooh,
and a sister.
you're at the bottom of that hierarchy, it sounds.
At the but what? Yeah, well, possibly, but possibly my
Mm.
sister was as well,
Oh.
by virtue of being a woman.
Mm.
Um, so there was that, and there was. I mean, if I start with British culture, most people have heard the term the stiff upper lip.
Mm-hmm.
And what that's really saying is a level of stoicism that means we don't talk about things and we repress things. And that was just as much the case, if not more so, in the Indian culture that I grew
Mm.
up in. Emotions, feelings weren't talked about, they weren't named. Things were kind of dealt with in this stoic sense of, well, you just have to get on with it.
Mm.
And including some of the grief over losing my dad was dealt with in that way.
Mm.
A sense of, well, we have to carry on. Um, so, in that sense, from a developmental perspective, there were some aspects that were really challenging and took a lot of work in adulthood
Mm.
to to um, to develop and to emerge.
This stoic kind of responsibility and expectation, do you feel that it was expected from your sisters as well? Or your sister as well? Is it just one sister that you had?
Just one sister,
I see.
yeah. Um, I guess in our family it was a little bit different. My dad would probably be described as he wouldn't have described himself this way, but he'd probably be described as a feminist.
Hmm.
And there's a couple of things that spring to mind. One is that typically when a child is born, or when you're celebrating anything in Indian culture, you give out boxes of sweets to your friends and your community.
Hmm.
But when a child was born, if it was a boy, you'd give out sweets. In back in the 70s, 80s.
Hmm.
If it was a girl, you wouldn't necessarily, or actually generally you wouldn't, because it was considered unfortunate to have a daughter, because a daughter would have to be married off, and a daughter is not as good as a son. My dad, when my sister was born, and she was the first born, he handed out sweets to the community, and some
Oh.
people sort of said to him, why are you handing out sweets?" And he said, "Well, I've had a child. I've got this beautiful girl. Of course, I'm handing out sweets."
Hmm.
Um, and then there was the other thing that springs to mind is he knew that he didn't have a good heart, in the sense that he had heart disease, and there may be something could happen to him. So he knew this before he had a heart attack, which is what killed him. We didn't know this, of course, but he and my mum knew, and so they were having lots of conversations about what if something happens to me.
Hmm.
And he said to my mum, "If anything happens to me, uh, my sister, his daughter, must go to university. She must go to university. She must be
Oh.
educated. They must all be educated." Now, my sister was 18 and a few months away from going to university when my dad died.
Oh.
And the entire community assumed that, okay, well, you need to get your daughter married. That's what you do now. You get your daughter married off. And my mum kept her promise to my dad and said, "Well, she's going to university." And people thought she was mad. They thought, "You are absolutely mad. You're a single mother now, and you've got 4 kids, and you're
Hmm.
sending your daughter off to university on her own." And she was keeping her promise to my dad. And my dad felt it was essential that all of us got an education, regardless of who we were.
Wow. That's really lovely. Thank you for telling that story, especially the sweet story is hitting Marty really hard right now, is what he'll say, in the soft spot. Um, Really beautiful and great kind of image of masculinity at that time. Are there things that you remember? It's hard to remember things in childhood. Marty knows. Is there anything that stands out for you, a memory with your father that you remember and that still kind of resonates with you today?
Yeah. Uh, and it's funny, some of these memories came back, later in adulthood. I've recently
Sure.
become a father. That's brought back more memories.
Mm.
And there's my dad, like most people, was complex. He had his flaws. He was nuanced and complicated, had many sides to him. And he worked, to give you a sense of the man. He worked in a factory. He worked
Mm.
typically 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. He worked shifts. He was very much a working man. He believed in working hard and being stoic and getting on with
Mm.
things. But that was, I think, to some extent, a role he felt he had to take up, and in terms of duty and responsibility, and that is why he had so much stress and pressure. But
Mm.
one of the memories I have that really shows you another side of him is probably when I was about 5 or 6. A bird landed in our back garden with a broken wing, and my dad, who had no particular great experience with animals, he took this bird and he got a shoebox and he kind of lined it with some newspaper, and then he kind of fed and nurtured and watered this bird, and he bandaged its wing until eventually it was strong enough to fly away. And I wrote something about this not long ago, and what I remember from that, or the word that I take away from that, is tenderness. There was a real tenderness
Mm.
in his actions. And for me, that is also masculinity, to show that level of care and tenderness towards another living thing.
Well, in order for there to be tenderness, there has to be muscle. So that may be that balance of the feminine and the masculine, right? The masculine being the muscle in the space as well as the tenderness. You can't have one without the other, right? Wow, that's really lovely. That's a really lovely memory. Going back to, thank you for kind of opening up about your past and now understanding how that kind of translates to the work that you do today, right? And going back into this men's circle, how do I don't want to get into your patented men's circle and try to steal it or anything like that, but how do you feel that these men's circles work? What's the overall structure of them? What do you seek as you kind of delve deeper and deeper into the circle?
Hmm. Um, I'm happy to share. There's nothing you could patent, I don't think, in the way we approach our work.
Yeah.
Um, I guess first of all, a lot of things happen before we even come together as a group. So the way we talk about what we're doing and the way we talk about these groups is clear on our website. It's clear when men make an inquiry about joining one of our groups.
Mm.
We have a conversation with everyone who makes an inquiry, just to get a sense of what they're looking for, what's drawn them to us, and to tell them about the groups and what they're about,
Mm.
and see how that fits. And then we share with them our principles. And so these are our principles. These are the things that articulate the types of conversations we're having, which might be
Sure.
different, probably are different to conversations you have elsewhere. And then they fill in a form to kind of say that they agree to abide by those principles. And we ask for a commitment, and they come to all of the sessions that we're going to have as a group.
And how long does the sorry to interrupt? How long does the men's circle usually last? How many sessions are there?
8 weeks usually, so
Okay.
8 conversations, eight
Mm.
weekly conversations. These are our free groups, and they're online.
Nice.
And then, so quite a lot has happened before we even come together as a group. There's a setting of foundations and a grounding and expectations
Mm.
are quite clear about what this group is for and what it's not for.
Mm.
So men typically arrive into the space with that kind of context and that expectation, and then we open each conversation. We have some practice in how we open each conversation. We do a grounding, very similar to what we did at the start of this
Mm.
conversation, with breathing and embodiment. We have some sort of opening of the space.
Okay.
So we usually do it the first week, and then we invite a different member of the group to do it in the following weeks.
Mm.
It could be a reading, it could be poem. We've had people sing a song, we've had people play a short clip,
Mm.
poetry, all sorts of things. Um, and then what unfolds from there and what's been created there is a space that is distinct from the rest of our lives and the conversations we typically have.
Mm.
And what emerges from there then becomes quite naturally more open, more honest, more courageous, more vulnerable.
Mm.
And our role as facilitators really is then to hold that space. And where we might need to, we might encourage the group to explore a different avenue or to go a little bit deeper. But generally, most of the work has been done in gathering the group together in that way.
Mm.
And then we bring each conversation to close in a certain way, and we bring each group to a close in a certain way, again with a recognition that this is closure now of this session or of this group.
Mm.
So that's how we do it. There's no great magical methodology to it. It's just intention and practice.
Okay. Well, Marty's always looking for the magical answer, but that'll suffice. Do you feel that you have this men's circle and you've been working with them for a while? I'm assuming multiple different types of groups and groups of men. Do you find that? I guess I have a question surrounding. Do you feel like it's enough for men to be in a space with other men in order to open up, and help to ask the appropriate questions for men to help themselves? Uh, or do you find that there may need to be a whole new perspective on therapy and kind of, you know, emotional help? Does that make sense? Do we have to revolutionize how we look at therapy and care and mental health in order for men to be a part of this?
Say a little bit more, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. I wonder if therapy, the way that it's developed, is more in line with helping women, right? I guess that's a question I have. That's not that I'm saying that that's the way it is, but I wonder sometimes, especially talk therapy, if that's better for women to explore and find whatever mental solutions that they need. I'm wondering if it's the same for men, or do we have to kind of look at it in a different way? Do we have to find a new path for therapy for men specifically to really benefit and have profound mental health?
That's an interesting question, because well, it kind of leads me to the question of what is different about men that would require a
Mm.
different approach. And yet, I think there is something in that question, and certainly, I think there's many ways to approach doing this sort of work. There's conversational based practices. There's
Sure.
embodied practices. There's doing things in nature. I think are
Mm.
incredibly powerful for men.
Agreed.
Sometimes doing something, some communal activity.
Mm.
I think can be could be a beautiful thing for men. And I know people who do this sort of work where men will go into the outdoors and they will make something together or
Mm.
cook something together. And there's a sense of returning to some of that community that we talked about. So I think there's many different ways to do this work, and I'd love to incorporate more of those ways into our
Mm.
work.
Interesting. It almost sounds like there's a kind of benefit in the doing for men, because I recently heard a quote from a friend of mine who said, "Men feel good when they do." Or hold on, wait, I'm messing it up. Marty's messing it up. Let me try it again. Men have to do in order to feel good, and women have to feel good in order to do, which I thought was very interesting because I don't know if that's completely true, but when I think about it, it does sound true. Marty feels better when he gets up and does something and gets into action, but also Marty's not a woman, so he doesn't know if the opposite is true, right? That's the difficulty of talking about the difference in genders, and then we talk about how we're all individuals anyway, so how can we really lump each other into a group? I mean, that's part of what we shouldn't be doing. Anyway, I wonder also when you talk about kind of this entrance into nature, right? Men going out into nature. What do you think is the value in nature and men trying to find out what they need to do or what they can become? Especially since we are so separated from nature and we don't really interact with it on a daily basis. So why would we need it in our lives?
Yeah, I mean that our disconnection from nature is at the heart of um, the environmental and
Mm.
climate challenges we're facing. Um, I mean, there's so much science around what happens when we go into nature. Things like the different shades of green that we recognize, which
Mm.
it's believed is a primal neurological thing.
Mm.
Things like there's a compound in mud and soil that has the same effect on serotonin as MDMA, so it gives us a natural feeling of
Oh,
elation, or in a very mild
ecstasy.
way. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, we're not going to eat mouthfuls of mud in a club, but it is having a some sort of natural effect. There's Nature's messy, and it
Mm.
reminds us that we are part of a much bigger story, and it reminds us of natural processes that are going on all around us.
Mm.
Things are blooming, things are dying, things are being born. Uh, there's all sorts of natural processes going on around us, and
Mm.
we're reminded of that when we go into nature. And also, when we do something like walk in nature with someone else, we're typically side by side. And for men, that means that there's much less of a confrontational feeling to being face to face and having a conversation. So for
Right.
some men, that's a much easier, safer entry point than sitting face to face with someone and having a
Mm.
conversation.
Well, it's also interesting because it creates a space of who's the leader, right? If you're walking next to each other, to one another, you're not really, necessarily, there's the opportunity for someone to lead, but it has to be a choice, right? Instead of it being designated to that particular person, right? Which I think is interesting. You say something beautiful, which is that nature is messy. And it's interesting because when we separate from nature, we forget that we're messy too. And in society, we feel like we're not allowed to be messy. Do you feel that it's crucial in your men's circles to let men be a little bit messy?
100%. I mean, the business of being human is messy. It's by definition messy. And one of the modern 20th, 21st century ideas that's got us so mixed up and it causes so much suffering is this idea that we should be, have it all figured out and have it
Mm,
all ordered.
mm,
We try to control nature in the same way we try to control our own experience of being humans.
mm.
It's a very rational, head-led approach to life. It's messy being a human. We're messy people.
How would you suggest for men, especially young men, who, you know, kind of are getting all these different ideas, these ideologies, these idols, right, in their gaze and in their ears? What's a way for them to allow themselves to be messy in the day-to-day world without being, I guess, dangerous to the world in a way?
Mm. Um, I think there's a lot around play and creativity
Mm,
that we often leave behind once we reach a certain age. That was certainly my journey, and I see it a lot in men. And again, it's part of that disconnection that we described. So there's something
right.
around finding whatever, returning to whatever made us playful and creative when we were
Mm,
children. Um, a practice, I wouldn't even call it a practice, just something that's been really helpful for me, my own journey, is to um, constantly be a beginner at something. I'm always learning something, which means I'm always being really shit at something. And that's great. That's a really great space to be in screwing up over and over again and being in the messiness of that learning process. I think is just so great for the ego and for the soul.
yeah. Well, and it sounds like if you're going to allow yourself to be messy, you have to have the perspective, a different perspective that allows you to look at that mess as something beautiful instead of something that should lead to self-destruction or self-deprecation or, like I'm not good enough, I'll never be good enough, kind of that mentality that may lead men and women into dark places, right?
Mm.
Hmm.
It leads back to that idea of either I've got to perform and
Mm,
achieve and be successful, or messiness is antithetical to that, and it's as you
right.
said, destructive and unhealthy, and many other
Hmm.
things that we don't want to be.
Well, you've reminded me a lot that life can be exciting and a challenge, right? That there's value in being competitive with the self as long as it's in a place of play and fun and the desire to be better, right? I think that's an important lesson that young men and men in general can take away. I guess the next question I have, or the next thing I'd love to investigate, and maybe the final thing, is talking about, what do you think the future of manhood is? What kind of world are we going to be in? I mean, you've dealt with a lot of men in your men's circles. You've also dealt with men and women in your coaching practice. Where do you see these individuals leading us into the next kind of zeitgeist?
Mm. It's something I think about quite a lot, and it's I certainly don't have a fixed, definite answer, but what I get a sense of, I'm often very uh, what might be deemed pessimistic about what's
Hmm.
happening in the world and what the future might look like. But there is also an optimistic side of me. And what I get a sense of through my work and just through what I'm seeing in the world is that there's a growing kind of undercurrent of or an energy developing for realizing that this isn't working and we need to change something about the way that we're operating as a species, if I can put it that way. And that's manifesting in part by things like a greater search for meaning. And also it's being vividly shown to us, those of us who are paying attention, through the breakdown of climate and all of the effects we're seeing around the world. So the optimistic side of me says that the change will come from that growing awareness of this isn't working, and what am I going to do about that?
Mm-hmm.
And also the external vivid pressure and growing pressure of this is getting real now. And so how are we going to respond to this? Who are we called to be in response to what's happening in the world? So where that leads, I don't know, but I'm increasingly involved in climate work and learning more about what's happening in climate, and the idea that we are going to need to adapt, and part of that adaptation might need to be return to smaller communities, return to this sense of tribe and collaboration and connection, rather than competing and destroying and extracting.
Well, I guess the risk of connecting again to the tribal reality is that there is that risk of dangerous and violent competition, right? I mean, we see it right now. We're in tribes as it is, right? Ideologically, socially, and we're very happy to attack other people without seeing how they really tick and seeing who they are as human beings, which is a real shame. What do you feel if, it seems that, it's interesting because with climate change, it's getting hot and, people, society are getting pretty hot and angry these days. What do you think is a healthy way to kind of divert that anger? What do you think we can be doing with that anger, especially men who are so easy to that one emotion? We're not allowed to feel any other emotion but anger. And so how do you feel we can, as men, take that energy and make it into something better?
I mean, I guess I think anger is often portrayed as an emotion we shouldn't have, particularly if we're men. And actually, anger is usually a signifier of something else, some other emotions that aren't being expressed or some needs that aren't being met. And that would be my curiosity, I guess. If you're feeling angry, what is it you're angry about?
Yeah.
What need isn't being met, or what fear might there be underneath that anger? And the answer to that is probably the answer to your question as to what can we do about this? In what way should I respond to this anger?
Sounds like we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions these days. A lot of questions. Well, just as a final note, what do you feel, if you could say anything to the men out there, just one line that maybe will help them go about their day, live their lives, kind of with that in the back of their mind, to kind of just help them either be messy, right? Ask the right questions, be in a space of play and levity. What's one thing that you would say to them?
Well, I'll borrow a line from someone else. I can't remember who said
Sure.
it. Who did you want to be before the world told you who to be?
That's a lovely, lovely question. Who did you want to be before the world told you who to be? Wow. Well, that's lovely. Jindy, thank you so much for joining me, for having this conversation. I had a great time. I hope you had a great time.
I really did.
Good.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Marty.
Lovely. Thank you for giving us your wisdom, your questions, your curiosities about the world. Where can people reach you if they are looking for coaching or to be a part of this men's circle?
Yeah. So for the men's work and the men's
Mm-hmm.
circles, leaderbrotherson.com.
Okay,
For my coaching practice, selfishleader.com. And you can
great.
find me on LinkedIn, of course, where I share a lot of content and ideas.
Lovely.
Jindy Mann.
I'll put all those links in the description so people could easily reach you. And just to close out this meeting of men, just another kind of breath in and breath out, maybe 2 or 3. Take a breath in and out. Giving my gratitude to Jindy for being here, for doing his work and continuing to do the work to change the world. And a breath in and out. And being grateful that we have this opportunity to communicate, for men to open up and be honest. Breath in and out one final time. Jindy, thank you so much for being here, and I hope we get to chat again soon.
Me too. Thanks, Marty. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you for joining me for this MENitation with Jindy Mann. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe to Marty's channel. Hit that notification bell so you know when I release more content. You could also become a martyr for manhood by donating monthly on Marty's Patreon page or his Buy Me a Coffee account. And until next time, I'll be here, waiting, ready to MENitate.